co-convener of the Civic and Moral Education Initiative, along with Carrie James. And we're really pleased that you are here for Michael Mary's talk about Does Inclusion Offer Educational Justice for Students with Autism? Before we let Michael get started, I'm going to tell you a couple things about the Civic and Moral Education Initiative, which is an initiative here at the Ed School, but with reach both across the university and beyond, where we try to create opportunities for people who think about civic and moral education issues broadly to come together and explore and learn and push the field forward together, whether that's through research or policy or practice. We have a colloquium series, of which this is one that's about monthly, and I think many of you were probably here for our colloquium with Eve Ewing last week, I think it was. And we have another one coming up November 15th, also from 12 to 1:30, with Christy Kultz. She'll be talking about the authoritarian turn in English education, academization, national imaginaries, and the making of neoliberal subjects. Which actually looks, which sounds like a mouthful, but I think it's going to be a really, really interesting exploration of how privatization, especially in British education, has been pursued, and I think you'll see a lot of interesting connections with privatization moves in United States education, in India and Brazil, and all sorts of places in which there's privatization movements happening both explicitly and implicitly. So I'll encourage you to do that. And also, we will have a sign-in sheet, both to document that you're here, because we're very grateful we get money from the Dean's office, and also, what is the name of the, how should I actually name your original? Yes.
It's all about this.
Okay. From the Gala?
No, X-Media.
X-Media Lab. And from the in support from the X-Media Lab for our work we do here, and it's helpful for us to show that you all are here. And also we have a listserv that shares information not only about our colloquia and soon-to-be student brown bag seminar series, where we will invite students to present, but also about conferences, about funding opportunities, jobs, other research assistantships, all sorts of things. And so we'll invite you to sign up for that as the sheet goes around, if you choose to. If you don't choose to, just don't get us your email, and we won't be able to get a hold of you. And just to give you a heads up for next semester, we have a really exciting set of programs planned around with issues, including rethinking migration, that is sort of trying to reimagine both the history of the world and the contemporary world around issues of migration and immigration and movements of populations across the globe. Some things on arts and creativity and civic engagement and children are citizens. So please, again, sign up and you'll find out about those things. But for today, I'm really, really excited that we have Professor Michael Mary here from the University of Amsterdam to talk to us. This is a chapter of his forthcoming book from Johns Hopkins Press on educational justice, where he'll be thinking with us about education and students with disabilities using autism as a specific example. Michael and I have known one another, I think now, for close to 20, well, I guess I can date it exactly because we met when my older daughter was 8 months old, and she's now 16. So we've known one another, I guess, for 15 years, ever since we were both newbies in the field of philosophy of education. And I'm really thrilled that he's here, because Michael's work is always totally fascinating and provocative. I have to bring this up because he has written more books since I looked last than I realized. So he has a book from 2007 on cultural identity and Islamic schooling and philosophical approach, which is totally fascinating and quite prescient, that I would encourage you to read. But also a new-ish one, I guess now 5 years old, but that I've ordered and have not yet read, on equality, citizenship, and segregation and defense of separation. And then his forthcoming book on educational justice. He teaches at the University of Amsterdam as a professor of philosophy in the Department of Child Development and Education, and also an associate member of both the Department of Philosophy and the Faculty of Humanities and the Department of Sociology. And he brings a really wonderful, both cross-cultural and cross-intellectual And then after Michael speaks, we're going to have a short response from our discussant, Krista Goldstein-Cole, who's an advanced doctoral student here in human development. She focuses on issues of trauma, belonging, and public policy. Her dissertation is examining how school connectedness can potentially mitigate and even potentially overcome, or at least buffer against the effects of child maltreatment and peer victimization and bullying both in childhood and into adulthood. Krista has had the most amazing biography, like all of our doctoral students have amazing biographies, but she just totally wows me with the work that she's done, really in all three branches of government, judicial, executive, and legislative branches, especially in the Pacific Northwest, focusing on child welfare, mental health, violence reduction, community engagement. She's a former high school teacher in English and social studies. She's been the editor, strategy and vision editor, and special editor for the Harvard Education Review. She's a presidential scholar and a long-term member of our early career scholars program here. So she's a fabulous person to be our discussant, and then we'll open it up to you for Q&A. We always have at least a good half hour for that, so please be thinking of your questions and comments, and we'll really look forward to a rich discussion after. And with that, I'll hand it over to Mike.
Thank you. So I tend to be a walker. I may go back and forth. You'll notice from the title of this talk, formulated as a question, that there are at least three terms which may not be clear to any of us, myself included. So, inclusion, which is really the idea, or if you like, the ideal, which has been formulated as policy in many of our countries. What does that entail? Not just as a sort of permission or as a basic right, but what would it mean more robustly to say someone is being included? This daunting concept of justice that you see there, and I've even got the educational variant there in the title, but what exactly we mean by justice, what does justice entail, and we've got all sorts of theories sort of knocking each other back and forth about which variables matter, which principles should be pushed to the front, how do we sort things out when they potentially clash, and then when we add or introduce the educational component, things are no more, not simpler by simply focusing the lens. They can actually become, in some ways, more complicated. And then finally, what is perhaps the easiest of the three difficult concepts, autism. And I formulated it this way because on this side of the Atlantic, but I think generally, this is the way we prefer to formulate it. Students or persons with autism. But I'm going to use throughout this presentation, or I may go back and forth, autistics. And I'm going to do so very consciously because I believe it's important, first of all, to listen to persons with autism and listen to how individuals who have autism prefer to be called. So we've had these kinds of conversations in several different discussions over the past half of a century. And so I don't want to presume as someone who does not identify as autistic to decide what the label ought to be. So you'll hear me go perhaps back and forth, but on the slides you'll see autistics, and I don't mean that to be an affront to anybody. But as I read what persons who are quite vocal in this discussion online have to say, these are often people on the higher end of the spectrum, demanding that they be called autistics and that they have agency. And I think that's important. So labels aren't everything. We don't solve it very much just by changing a label, but it might be a step in the right direction. This was my clicker, is that right?
Yeah.
So very quickly, and this is going to be a sprint in a way to the end, just to give you some sense of what I'm doing in this chapter. And as Mira said, this is really just falling smack in the middle of a much larger book project on educational justice, in which what I'm attempting to do here is, as an ethicist, examine some very complex questions around a very specific set of ideas involving very specific actors, and that's already messy enough. So that already makes it difficult, but it's easy for some of us, certainly people younger than me in any case, to forget that not that long ago, before we were talking about inclusion, exclusion was the norm. So to paraphrase Elizabeth Anderson, when she wrote her book on the imperative of integration, she said roughly, if segregation was the problem, then integration is the solution. I'm paraphrasing. That may not have been literally what she said, but you can recognize a similar logic here. If exclusion is the problem, and I don't know that any of us sitting here this afternoon would endorse exclusion of any sort, at least not on the face of it, not without more information, then it seems that inclusion would obviously be some sort of a corrective. Now, within my lifetime, we've seen this type of change to policy. So this is not that long ago. And I'm just, again, rushing through some of these details so that you can get a sense of where we are now. And notice, because I'm going to talk about autism, notice autism really makes its entrance here in the 90s, quite explicitly. If somebody wouldn't mind shutting those doors, because that's distracting me, it must be distracting to somebody else. So this gives you a sense of what the legal entitlements are about. And IDEA, or Individuals with Disabilities Act, is really a kind of an expansion on the original legislation, and it has been updated even since the late 90s. So here we are with inclusion. Look at the US. This is one of the more recent iterations of what the requirement for inclusion would look like. And as with most policy speak, we've got very broad verbiage. But notice that the focus is on access, due process, inclusion, protection from discrimination. Okay? Now, I live and work in the Netherlands, and so this is, check out this date here. This policy, which in Dutch is called passend onderwijs, that means simply suitable education. This is 4 years old. So it's even more recent, this idea. Now I've translated here roughly what it says in the Dutch policy, and I've tried to emphasize a few things here. First of all, needs, identifying what the needs are, and that the inclusive educational environment should be adapted. Notice the assumption here under the inclusion idea is that to the greatest extent possible, children should be educated together. And again, who would be against that idea? I mean, no one wants, on the face of it, to defend exclusion on the basis of some characteristic that any of us may have. But the Netherlands, like a lot of continental Europe, has long had a separate educational network of schools. We still have them here in the United States, of course. So I hail from Wisconsin. We still have a school for the blind. We have 2 schools for the deaf. Those schools are still very much in business, if you like. And there's even been an uptick in enrollments in recent years. So one of the things that's also happening in the Netherlands is that parents who have children who have special needs, autism being a specific sort, are finding, to their frustration or to their exasperation, things are not going according to the ideal, to the policy, and they're pulling their children out in no time at all, again, 4 years old, and putting them back in what are called special schools. So those are schools designed to meet the needs of children with various disabilities. Again, in theory, because it's not necessarily the case that those schools will do an adequate job either. That's a separate empirical question. But you probably didn't notice this, or you passed over it, and I did that on purpose, and that's this bit here. That all children, not just any particular subset of children, are entitled to an inclusive education or an education adapted to their needs. So that's pretty much all-inclusive. And that's just by way of introduction, how we talk about it in terms of policy, where we do a kind of, whoops, I gotta remember this thing is on, because I don't actually hear my voice. Here are some key ideas, probably half of you, if not more of you, know about these in the American context. These are some ideas that really matter from the standpoint of legal entitlements. Free and appropriate public education in a least restrictive environment, and the IEP, or the Individualized Educational Program, is designed around the specific needs, or ought to be designed around the specific needs of children who qualify as having a limitation of some type, physical or otherwise. And there are all of these things that we could, if we wanted to, spend hours on going into. What would it mean, for example, to develop creative strategies, just to take one example, to best adapt the learning environment to the needs of a particular child, and then ask yourself, if you haven't already, that might be why you're sitting here, how do you do that attentively and do it for everyone else attentively at the same time? And do we have the resources to do that? And when I say resource, I don't just mean money. So we mean personnel, and we mean other types of ways in which we're attentive to the needs of individuals in their respective histories and characteristics. Let me make sure I didn't skip anything. Okay, so who am I talking about? Now, all of us probably have a general understanding of autism. We know it's a spectral disorder, a neurospectral disorder. Few things we could say, because like any group or category of individuals, wouldn't matter which one we were discussing or describing, highly diverse group of individuals. So what I've tried to do here is just identify a few items that we might say the vast majority of autistics share in common. So I'm not going to read them to you because you can read them on your own, but notice too. Yeah? Okay. All right, very good. So what's on the screen here, we've got atypical communication and social interaction, strong preoccupations with particular interests or hobbies, general discomfort in large group settings. Just three items we might find commonly in an autistic population, irrespective of where on the spectrum you happen to be. And notice too that this condition of autism is frequently comorbid with, that means it operates in tandem with dyslexia, ADHD, OCD, and many autistic individuals have the whole package. So that makes it potentially more complicated than just saying, we've got an individual with autism. You'll need to know more. And again, because I'm interested to do ethics, which is to say, identify what relevant moral principles there may be applicable to this question or this situation, taking into consideration the complexity of that situation and deciding what's the most morally responsible thing to do given those variables, given those possible outcomes. Or, if you like, even given the potential harms, to make it more precise. Now, why focus on this category of individuals? I could have focused on anyone or any group of atypical students. Because if you're talking about inclusion, and inclusion policies, by and large, are aiming to target those who do not map onto the average. So atypical would also capture persons we nowadays refer to as gifted. That's a whole other complicated conversation to have. Here's why I'm trying to focus on autistics here for the purposes of this chapter, this ethical analysis. In many respects, autism for philosophers, talking about rational individuals engaged in a conversation, or as we like to say in political philosophy, engaged in deliberation around what we ought to do, we as a citizenry. Persons identifying as or diagnosed as autistic are a kind of paradigmatic case. That is, by the majority of folks, they're not seen as rational in the conventional sense. So perhaps helpful to use autism for that purpose alone, because it challenges the idea that it's only rational persons who are able to enter into this conversation. Indeed, that's what many of the most outspoken autistic individuals are challenging. Who are you, dominant group? Who are you, non-autistics, to tell us that we're not capable or we lack the capacities to participate in this discussion? That's something to bear in mind. Second, the significant increase in the number of diagnoses of autism in the last quarter of a century. Now, whether that uptick in the number of diagnoses is because there are more cases of autism or because we're able to diagnose more cases is an open question. Okay? So that's another reason. The prevalence of autism in our schools. Third, as I've just stated on the previous slide, the fact that there are a number of other challenges that children who have autism also possess simultaneously, such as dyslexia, OCD, etc. And fourth, the challenges that schools face in providing the services they're often required by law to receive. Now, in this chapter, I devote a lot of attention to the legal context or the legal framework of the United States, and the reason I do that instead of some other country is because the United States has one of the oldest sets of protections, legal protections in place, and it has some of the most robust, particularly since the signing of the 1990 Americans with Disabilities Act, which expands the rights and protections of persons with disabilities into the public domain to a much greater degree than you find in most parts of the world. Now, if that's a best case scenario, it also stands to reason that by looking at the American case, which we won't do so much this morning or this afternoon, but which I do more so in the chapter, how does the argument for inclusion hold up in a best case scenario in light of the empirical facts or the empirical information that we have given the sets of challenges we're confronted with? Everything clear okay so far? Any questions so far? Now here come these annoying folks. And we philosopher types, we start to ask questions. What do you mean by that? What exactly, just as I did on the opening slide, on the title page, what exactly is the definition of that concept? Or what's your intention in using that or introducing that idea? So how we construe some of these very ordinary ideas can determine a great deal about how we think about it, how we proceed, and what sorts of solutions we think it best appropriate to try and solve or mitigate some of the injustices that we may confront. Now, just mention two, because these are two ways of framing disability itself. That's a whole conversation. What is a disability? Who is really disabled? Are you really disabled? And who determines that? Those are all questions that not just postmodernists get to ask, like, who says? That's a legitimate question that should be asked about any of these labels, particularly when there is a power dynamic present, and particularly when there is a strong possibility of stigma and exclusion. And that certainly is true here. So, very briefly, and these have different labels, depends on who you read. So I've just put on the screen medical and neutralist. Sometimes you'll hear someone like Varela Terzi refer to this as the individual model versus the social model. But I'm going to use these labels because I think they're more suited to my purposes here. The medical understanding of disability is you have a deficit. Just like if one of us is sick, there's something wrong with you, the doctor might say. You need some medication, or you need some sort of therapy, or you need some sort of corrective, something to compensate for that deficit that you have. That's a medical understanding. And we think, when I say we, for the purposes of this talk, I'm talking about just majority populations, or persons in positions of decision-making, having that sort of a power or entitlement to make decisions for other people, in particular minority groups. By diagnosing who has a disability and what they need, or how they deviate from the norm, I'm describing this as a medical understanding of disability. You lack something that the rest of us we presume to have. You clearly want to be, or if you had the choice, you would have opted to be like us. And here is, if not a cure, here's a way to either compensate for or mitigate the difficulties you encounter. Okay, that's a medical understanding. A neutralist understanding would be the following. It's a response to this medical understanding. Who are you to tell me there's something wrong with me? Who are you, so-called non-disabled individuals, to come up with these labels that identify, categorize, pigeonhole others, use that as a power trip to make decisions or write policy where you effectively determine who needs help and how that implicitly, if not explicitly, serves to stigmatize and exclude individuals who are now in that kind of paternalistic relationship where some of us are able to provide help and the others are perceived as needing help and being the recipients of help. So this is understood to be a problematic framing. By using the neutralist understanding of disability, we're trying to neutralize what disability is taking to mean. Where my autism, to use the case study I'm thinking about, is not a disability, it's a difference. Some of you have brown hair, some of you have black hair, some of you have gray hair, some of you have blonde hair. And we wouldn't say that those people who have a certain hair color are, by definition, let's hope we don't say that, by definition, there's something wrong with you or there's some deficit that you have. These are just differences. Some of us are taller, some of us are shorter, some of us have a different body shape, some of us have a different personality type, and what we call disability is like that. Okay, now that's two different ways of thinking about, rather provocatively in the second case, what we understand disability to mean or not mean, and how we might think about it, and then how that might change our perception. Now there are problems with both of these. Whereas the neutralist is an attempt to correct for the first, the neutralist introduces its own set of problems. So if someone has autism or is found somewhere on that autistic spectrum, by denying that they have a disability, the question for the neutralist might be, how then might we better serve persons with autism? If we effectively deny that there is something there to be attended to. Would we be unable, in other words, to actually administer suitable education, reasonable accommodation? There's different ways of thinking about it. Remember, this is a sprint. We could spend a whole day on just this one slide. Now, we spent 2 weeks on this slide, but we're not going to. So, educational justice, big idea, far too big for one afternoon, or for that matter, for a lunch break. So, to make things simple, I want to just narrow it down to one single principle, probably more often than not used as a guiding principle in how we think about justice. And that's what I'm going to call the equality principle, where we could construe equality to mean everyone enjoys equal status, everyone has equal access. Think about just getting to this room. Did you have equal access to this room? Everyone is, and their differences are recognized, and we might even go on to say, as having equal value. And fourth, that everyone gets equal treatment. Now, why, you're wondering, some of you, why is that little asterisk there? And that's to remind me to say the following. When we talk about equality generally, or when we talk about it in more specific instances or iterations, let's take treatment. Equal treatment will not mean, many of you already know, that you get identical treatment. If we care about justice, we will care about everyone getting what they need, not whether everyone gets the exact same. The exact same amount of time, the exact same amount of attention, the exact same amount of money, etc. So every semester when I administer exams, I have students who approach me with requests for additional time to take their exam because owing to a particular condition that they have. One way in which the equality principle is expressed in that particular context is to do what is equitable, where a person's condition now, as a matter of justice, demands special consideration. So that's one way to think about it. When we move to this idea of inclusion, we know it's a complicated idea. We've seen what the policy has to say about inclusion, but I want to get to what we might say as philosophers or just as critical thinkers, what we understand inclusion to entail. And I want to suggest already that it's going to entail more than simply accommodating you. We'll allow you to sit down. We'll allow you have our permission to enter the room. You can join our group. That kind of toleration approach. I'm going to suggest to you at a minimum we can do better than that, and that any understanding of justice will demand that we do far more than that. And it's also going to demand that we do more than simply settle for the minimum. When we talk about an acceptable level of education, this is in the United States, and in the last 2 decades it's become a matter of contentious debate. It's been taken to court a number of times around autism and around other cases of special education and inclusion. My child is in school. My child is permitted to be there. My child is protected by an IEP, but my child is effectively being neglected. My child is not being challenged. My child is being given the bare minimum. So, just as a way to get us thinking about it. Now, that was, let's say, on a common sense understanding, we want to get beyond just the minimum. What if we wanted to say something more substantive? What would what I'm calling the moral features of inclusion, not simply legal entitlements, you have access now, you're permitted to come into the cinema, or join the seminar, or have voting rights, but that it means a lot more than that. These are 4 criteria that I want to introduce here. Maybe we can come back to it in the Q&A, I don't know. Does the inclusion have value to the individual? You're included in something you don't care about. So the meaning or the application of inclusion is itself kind of what? A vacuous entitlement, perhaps. We're going to include you in our Shakespeare club and you have no interest in Shakespeare. We're going to include you in our swimming team. You're not looking to try out for the swimming team. So it's got to be something I care about, or that you care about, or the individual in question cares about. Number 2, that there should be not just legal access, but real meaningful access. And for meaningful access at a minimum, it wouldn't just be you're entitled to attend Michael's talk today, but that there are effectively the physical means of getting here. We had to come up a flight of stairs, I noticed. So that might be one way we need to think about it beyond simply the legal entitlement or the legal right. And extending from that I don't just get here and nobody talks to me, and I feel completely alone and isolated, and even maybe altogether ignored, but I come to appreciate, maybe not immediately, but over time, a sense of belonging. And finally, this is where a lot of things are riding on this aspect, that this inclusion is conducive to my well-being. Well-being is another one of those fantastically rich concepts about which so much has been written, and there are many different competing theories around well-being. Do we appeal to an objective standard? Do we look to a list? And we try to see whether or not the quality of your life conforms to that list? Do we listen to your personal or subjective preferences, and we see how well your personal subjective preferences are being satisfied, and in many other ways we can think about well-being. I'm not here today to solve that big puzzle. It's simply to say that this is how I'm personally thinking about inclusion in a more robust sense than legal entitlement. And this may matter when we move to the inclusion of children with disabilities generally, and the inclusion of children with autism more specifically. So, speaking of children with autism, here are 4 ideas, and I have adapted these from my colleague Ingrid Robangs, who wrote a paper in the Journal of Medical Ethics a couple of years ago, and she's one of maybe the only person who's written about well-being and autism that I'm aware of. Now, other people have written about autism, and lots of people have written about well-being, but trying to combine these 2 things, Robangs is one of the few. So I'm adapting something here from Robangs, namely, when I think about inclusion in a morally robust sense for autistics, I have the following 4 in mind. Protection against sensory overload. That's a big one. If we need to get past number 1, we might be on our way. Number 2, a need to communicate, perhaps in non-conventional ways, not in the ways in which non-autistics are accustomed to communicating. 3, a need to be understood. I think we all have that need, so we share that in common. Number 4, a need to be cared for. That sounds like a universal as well. So when I delineate these 4 features of inclusion, as I'm thinking about them with respect to children with autism, I don't mean to imply or suggest that these are only applicable to children with autism. As we just recognize, I hope we would find ourselves or recognize ourselves in any number of these, including number 1. But for autistic individuals, this would be particularly a concern as we think about not only inclusion, but as we think about what is just. Now, there are at least 2, there are many others, but I'm just going to name 2 because they're the 2 that I've referenced in this discussion, in this chapter on inclusion and educational justice. 2 frameworks. One is a care framework, and there's several individuals that we can think of here, maybe most famously Nell Noddings, but she's not alone. And how we think about what is the right thing to do, what is the just thing to do, how do we apply the equality principle where persons with autism are concerned, or where persons are concerned generally, because they certainly don't restrict their ethical writings to those populations. We think about how we take care of other individuals. And there's a clear understanding that there is a person offering care and there's a person receiving care. But philosophers like Noddings also understand this to be a reciprocal relationship. So it's not merely a paternalist relationship. You need me, and I've got something to give you. So that's one way to think about it in the philosophical literature. And another way that's gotten a lot of attention since Amartya Sen first developed this idea back in the early 80s is what's called capabilities approach. Apologies to those of you who already know this stuff and you've mastered it and you wrote your dissertations on it, but this is my little brief overview of what these ideas are about. So capabilities is a very, perhaps, fancy word to explain or to try to capture how, or represent how a person's freedoms to achieve their valuable functionings. It's not enough to simply, again, give you legal entitlements or tell you you are free to choose A or B or C. There have to be capabilities present where it's possible to activate those freedoms, and this matters in particular for persons with disabilities who might be given the same entitlement to do what non-disabled persons are entitled to do, but they're not able to activate those freedoms owing to other constraints. So they are less able, again, in general, to act upon those things they have reason to value. Now, whether you're talking about the care approach or the capabilities approach, and with respect to disability, people like Martha Nussbaum, Laurella Terzi, and again, Earl Banks have all adopted Sen's idea or framework to help us think about disability. These are just 2, they're not the only ones. Try to make our brainstorming here this afternoon not an overload in itself. 2 ways we might think about it or begin to frame the ethics of inclusion. Now, what do these theories offer us besides, let's say, a very abstract way to talk about what it is that we have reason to be concerned with here this afternoon? Well, these theories can help us identify what the relevant principles are that matter. And I've highlighted one. It's not the only one. You could identify other ones like respect, for example. But for this discussion, how does the equality principle, how should it be interpreted, how should it be applied, how should it be best understood where these individuals are concerned in this context? So it can provide us with some real moral guidance in how we identify, define, frame, and justify what it is that matters, that's applicable to this set of moral questions. These theories can also help us think through, but perhaps not solve, how best to make trade-offs when we have conflicting principles. So in education, but in many domains, the principle that matters to all of us here of equality, and there's another principle that matters to everyone here, namely the principle of liberty. These 2 things, as often as they may go together, they can just as often clash. So they may go together in the following way. To the extent that everyone enjoys liberty equally, we see these two principles nicely conjoined. Equal liberty. But if I am now called upon to choose, or perhaps limit my choice, right? I have certain freedoms to exercise thinking about my options in this way, but so do other people, and I have to take those considerations or those concerns into account. I may be called upon to restrict what I'm free to do. So John Stuart Mill talked about this. He called it the liberty principle. I'm free to do whatever it is I care to do, so long as in doing so I don't restrict the liberty of someone else to do exactly the same. I'm roughly paraphrasing Mill there. So there are ways in which these theories, care, capabilities, there are many others, might help us do these things. But these theories, I submit to you, please tell me I'm wrong. I welcome public humiliation in the Q&A. Tell me if I'm wrong that these theories may not help us settle concrete cases. They may help us think about it. They may help us clarify things. They may help us to prioritize the things that matter. They may not help us to solve what it is that we have reason to care about. Now, just take care, very briefly. All the care in the world, the most caring individuals in a hospital, in a school, in a neighborhood association, in a university faculty. Imagine everyone around you was just oozing with care. Now, I submit to you that all that care, as important as it is, it still may not be able to deliver the goods, so to speak, or administer the justice that we seek, so long as there are profound structural inequalities in the environment. That is, the conditions under which and in which caring individuals are forced to labor and administer care can be, to say the least, constraining. Or take the capabilities approach. Folks like Nussbaum herself have said it's not a comprehensive moral doctrine. It's not going to provide us with all of the ways that we need to think about these problems. It's a helpful tool. So, by introducing two philosophical frameworks, two liberal philosophical frameworks, I'm not endorsing either one of them. I'm saying these are two ways in which various philosophers in the past roughly 35 years have encouraged us to think about and examine cases involving disadvantage, care, disability, and so forth. Now, you've heard what I had to say about inclusion, justice, various characteristics of autistic individuals. What do I understand inclusion to mean for autistic individuals? And I'm now to my last two slides. At least I think so. Sometimes I say that and then it's three. And I'm embarrassed. I think there's two. And here's what I want to say about this. Because, again, there's a whole story behind this one slide. So if you go digging into the empirical literature, which I do, I read a great deal of it, we know, and I hate it when people say that, but I'm going to say it anyway, we know. Because usually when people say we know, it means, they and their group. But here's what the consensus in empirical literature on these questions time and again demonstrates. What we know, go back to that previous slide about structural inequalities in schools. How children not only come to be labeled, but how they become, in many cases, warehoused in schools, isolated in schools, stigmatized in schools, bullied in schools. The literature is, I'm sorry to announce, very conclusive. So it's disconcerting how many studies show, time and again, children with disabilities in average schools are stigmatized and bullied at far higher rates, and children with autism in particular. That's a disconcerting piece of news to share. And perhaps because of that, the second item on the screen, the parents are none too happy about that. I mean, it is your child after all. You want your child, even if your child has limited capacity to learn, let's say alongside of the other kids, which is of course not always the case. So one of the boys that I shadowed as an autistic student some 20 years ago, he was in the top math class, for example. But you would, at a minimum, want your child to be in a safe environment. You, at a minimum, want your child to be protected. You want your child to have friends. You want your child to feel welcome. You want your child, in other words, to receive the care that he or she deserves. And this is what the data consistently suggests. Now, I'm going to do my very best in the next 60 seconds to wrap this up, so we've got some Q&A. That's the empirical bit. Here's what I'm suggesting, and maybe we can get to this now in a discussion after we hear from our respondent. Inclusion, I want to suggest, in regular educational settings is not a proxy for justice. Remember, we started with exclusion was the norm, and in many countries today, it may shock you to learn that exclusion is still the norm. Disabilities, autism, sorry, we've got no place for you here. There's no education. That's true in many countries in Europe right now, and I'm just talking about Europe. So if you go around the world, the story gets even more bleak. If exclusion is the norm, inclusion must be the solution, you heard me say. Not necessarily. Things might get worse. So that depends very much on what we're looking at. What's the scope of inclusion? So what does it actually mean? What does it entail? And what's motivating inclusion policies? So there's very strong evidence to suggest, given the state of political affairs in the Netherlands right now, that what's motivating inclusive education is slashing budgets, spending less money, shut down those schools, it's costing us too much. So what's motivating the policy? What are the specific dimensions of well-being? So who is the individual? What is his or her specific need? What is his or her specific experience? And this might be novel to some of us, what is the autistic individual's expressed preferences? And just as we might do ethically with children of a certain age more generally, the older a child is and the more articulate a child, let's say, or to adapt it to the autistic case, the more someone is able to communicate what their preferences are, maybe there is reason to take that seriously into account in this ethical analysis. Who will ultimately decide what's in a child's best interest will always remain a complex matter. And so to give you really, really short, I don't know what the English expression is, just cutting to the chase. To cut right to the chase, what I'm going to suggest here is when there is doubt, that the parent in most cases is in a better position to know what is in his or her child's best interest. Notice I said in most cases. It said we would perhaps say that about children more generally. What is justice required? We pay attention to the well-being of the child. This should be paramount, I want to suggest. And we need to look at some of those characteristics. If we're talking about autism, what are the specific dimensions of well-being as they pertain to children with autism? What role do the parents play? Our solution in this ethical analysis about what educational justice demands will probably yield very different responses depending on the individuals in question. Sometimes, sadly, but that is our reality, justice much of the time is a small j. It's how do we move, to use a football metaphor, how do we move the ball a little bit further down the field? So can we, at a minimum, reduce the harm being done? If a child is being bullied, it's a score for justice just to eliminate the bullying. That may not mean you have satisfied or dealt with all of the other concerns. And something that has run through a lot of my work over the last decade or more is whenever we're thinking about justice in the educational domain, there cannot be a, if you like, a kind of unqualified belief in the school as being, in the mainstream school as being the solution for all of our ills. And that's not a radical thing to say. Lots of people have said that. But what a lot of people who believe that are then not prepared to say is we need to perhaps actively seek out pragmatic alternatives. That means actively looking outside of the school for ways to deliver educational justice where the school is ill-equipped to do so. That's it. Thank you very much.
Okay, now maybe the system go crazy and I don't have to fix it. So I'm sort of new to this discussant role. This is only the second time I've done this discussant role. And it's such a wonderful and interesting and fascinating thing because, among other things, you get to see the paper in advance, right? So I've seen the paper and the talk, and none of you have seen the paper, right? So, and the paper is fascinating and wonderful and incredibly provocative, to say the least. And so I do wish we had more time to go into the details. And I think what I'm going to do here is just focus in one particular area of the wonderful range of ideas that Michael has provided to us today. And that is to really drill down into this question of well-being and what is it that well-being requires of us in terms of justice. But I want to start by saying that I really appreciate this use of autism as an illustrative case for inclusion, right? Of course, we have a range of disabilities in every society, whether we're talking about the Netherlands or the US. There are always a range of conditions that people encounter. And so this question of, is autism a good representative case, or does it in some way set aside from what we normally need to consider when we think about inclusion? And I happen to think that this is a terrific example when it comes to justices, injustices, structural barriers, and this idea of use of resource and how we're deploying our resource on behalf of well-being. And that's because two things. First of all, because there are so many intra-group differences, right? As Michael points out to us, we have the spectrum with autism, and then among young people with autism, we also have comorbidities, like kids who also have ADD or who also have OCD, in addition to the autistic spectrum that they face. And this is a very common experience. Comorbidity is very common. So for example, kids with Down syndrome have a broad range of issues that they face, and they're different one from the next. So there are these large intra-group differences. And so I think part of what Michael does here is to call on us to think about some of those intra-group differences and what they mean and how they challenge us in our work. But the second reason that I think that autism is such a good example and provides such a good opening for this conversation is because of the invisibility of certain aspects of the disorder. So Michael alludes here in his talk to this issue of sensory overstimulation. He talks much greater length in the book chapter about that issue. So for autistics, sensory perception is incredibly acute. You'll hear stories of kids who can hear a siren that's 2 or 3 or 8 blocks away, and for that child, it doesn't sound like it's 8 blocks away. It sounds like it is in their head and very loud and very scary, right? And so to come into a school environment where you have lots of people and you have lots of noise and you have huge amounts of visual stimulation that's different from one setting to the next, is going to be something that requires a high level of energy and navigation for an autistic child, right? But for those of us who are not autistic, we can't see that, right? We don't have that experience of sensory overload, and we only really know that it's real for the child when we see a shift in their behavior, right? What we witness is the a shift in the child's behavior. And that is a common problem among many kinds of invisible disability. So for example, among people with depression who find it difficult to be motivated or to be present or to have enough energy or enough concentration. It's incredibly present for kids with ADD who can't sort of ramp up enough focus to really get themselves narrowed down to a particular place. And for those of us who aren't suffering from that particular challenge, we only see it when we see the shift in behavior. And so that's one of the reasons I very much appreciate this case study, because I think both in terms of disproportionate discipline, which Michael doesn't talk about very much, but is a very significant problem in the United States. I mean, we have this highly developed law and this legal structure that's supposed to help us and that pushes us towards inclusion of kids. And too often what happens is those kids come to school, they behave in ways that are reflective of the well-being challenges that they're facing, and we respond punitively, right? We respond with discipline, and in particular, especially in low-resource schools with high populations of kids of color, we eventually respond with incarceration. So I think that there are these indications of how much well-being is a challenge for us. And so I appreciate this case study as helping to call that out. So I'd just like to take 1 minute to go through the four, what is the name that you gave to them? The moral features of inclusion, right? How do these moral features of inclusion, and then these 4 areas of well-being, how we think about well-being for autistic children. So the first one is that we protect from sensory overload, right? But I begin to wonder how we protect against sensory overload if we, in that collective way that Michael refers to it, don't recognize the veracity of it, right? If we don't recognize that this is truly a process that is underway for autistic children that is real and impacting them prior to when we see any behavioral changes, right? How do we really protect if we're invested in a structural way, not buying into the veracity of that experience, right? And so I think that challenges us in a deep way. The second is fostering communication. And again, I think we're very disabled here as the carers in this environment. If we don't understand and really appreciate and give credence to the veracity of the experience of sensory overload, then how can we effectively communicate about it, right? And how are we actually allowing communication back from our students if we are doubting that veracity and authenticity of the experiences that are driving them, right? So I think we are deeply challenged on our side in implementing these ideas. And the third is this idea that the child needs to be understood, right? And so I think that this becomes the place where our ableism is very real, right? If we are to meaningfully understand, not just in a words that you say to me kind of way, or even in a thinking of behaviors, communication kind of way, but genuinely understand what is the experience that we are including here, we have to let go of some of these issues of veracity and authenticity. And then finally, he calls for us to care, right? That there's this right to be cared for. And I really do feel that we can't be caring for something that we refuse to see, right? So as long as a disability is invisible and it has components as mental health does, as attentional issues do, as many medical conditions do, as certainly as autism does, have these invisible elements where those of us who don't have the disability don't see until in the behavior shift. I don't know how it is that we can care for something that we don't see. And so I begin to wonder whether what we need to do to move us towards justice is a new way of seeing, a new way of understanding, a new way of trying to bridge this gap in understanding. And so I do wonder, I was told that I should leave with a single question. So here's the single question that I have come to, and that is, while this vision of education justice leaves the choice of inclusion with students with disabilities and their parents, right? So there's inclusion out there. You can be included in our schools. We have these legal structures for inclusion, and the choice should be with the parents and with the students. And I think that is like a necessary first step. But I do wonder if we can get to educational justice if there's not an equal call to educators and on educators to pursue the knowledge, skills, and attitudes necessary to advance well-being. Whether it's far beyond a legal structure and comes down to an issue of how we go about not just challenging our ableist views, but also learning to act differently and behave differently. And does this pursuit of educational justice require that we build that bridge from both sides? That we continue to build the structures for inclusion, the legal structures for inclusion, but also at the same time, and necessarily so, do we also have to require that we develop what Michael calls resources, and that is the knowledge, skills, and attitudes and capabilities of educators to really address those things that cannot be seen so that we can develop care for individuals that are in our classroom.
First, it made it very easy for me because I can just agree with everything she just said. Yes, all the above. I've already spoken at length, so I want to hear more from the audience. If you have questions or comments or objections, remember I invited you to tell me I'm dead wrong. Yeah.
I have a question. You mentioned the models of disability,
Yeah.
and I was wondering if you include the cultural model in your book, and if yes, what do you think about it?
The cultural model? Can you tell me what you mean by the cultural model?
Like the idea that disability is a cultural assumption that we all, like, that made by the non-disabled population, and thinking that, you know, being disabled is a cultural factor and not genetic or...
Yeah, actually that's a great question, and so I do discuss at length in the chapter what you're describing as a cultural model, and it falls neatly under the so-called neutralist understandings. That's one variant, which is to say disability is a social construction, or am I missing something you were trying to say?
Yeah, but it's kind of different because it's not yes and no, because it's kind of saying that everybody is disabled. So like everybody cares, and why we created these norms that we, you know, like in the cultural model disagrees with these norms. We're trying to say everybody has their disability, and we just have to, the culture has to accommodate to every person individually. So it's like a more positive view of the seeing disability.
Yeah, okay. So maybe it's because I'm unfamiliar with the cultural model of disability that I'm going to, maybe I'll be wrong about this, but I think that the response there is what the capability theorists, but they also share this in common with the neutralists, namely to say that what we call disability is in large part owing to our failure to arrange the environment in such a way that persons end up being disabled where they otherwise wouldn't be. Does that come nearer to your concern?
I was just interested if you know about it, because I studied in Vienna.
Mm-hmm.
So
the Viennese have their own labels for everything.
It's a German
Yeah.
theorist that I talked about in one of my papers, and I just have been thinking about it ever since.
Yeah, so what I recognize in what you said, it would be definitely taken up by capability theorists on the one hand, difference or neutralist theorists on the other. And some go so far as to say, the difference folks and the neutralist folks go so far as to say disability really doesn't exist. It's a total social construct. The capabilities theorists do not. They try to navigate a way through these two sort of extremes of the medical deficit idea or the cultural, what you call the cultural model. Thank you for the vocabulary. Yeah.
So first of all, thank you for being here. I've learned a lot here since. So my name is Leah, and I'm in the school leadership program, and I'm interning currently in a fully inclusive school.
Okay.
And I've worked at a couple of it most of my career. And my question, I'll try and piece this up as best I can, is about well-being in the specific, in the context of like academic performance. And a lot of parents I've spoken to over the years who said like, it's so great. I feel like we're moving towards justice for my young person because this is the first time my son has felt safe in school. But the narrative of well-being stops for a lot of these parents at like, for the first time my kid is happy in school. They might not necessarily be like provided the same access to like instructional content. They're not doing as well academically, whatever that means. But like, does well-being, I don't know if this makes any sense, but like, is it enough? Are we just? Are we like walking towards justice if like we're just thinking about well-being in the context of safety, or does it also include like some kind of narrative around like success, whatever that is? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes total sense. And that's where the conversation gets started, right? Because different folks, both in the well-being literature, would have different takes on that. How do we even determine what the features of well-being are? But then on the more practical level, what do we think here, those of us in this kind of multidisciplinary team sitting around discussing the IEP of so-and-so, and everyone agrees that she is well-adjusted and happy, right? Is that okay? Check and move on? Is that progress? Is that well-being in any robust sense, or have we just managed to remove the obstacles to misery, right, effectively? So how we answer that question, I can attempt to do it abstractly, but then I get very quickly out of my comfort zone, because I feel like on questions like this, we really have to look at specific cases. On some questions around educational justice, I think we can go to bigger, or let's say more abstract ways of talking about it. Here, with well-being, we will have to, on the one hand, identify what we think the features of well-being are, and then see how well these apply to specific individuals, and also make a determination based on, let's say, their response to or their improvement in a particular context, their well-adjustedness, whether we think that suffices as well-being. So, I don't know, just attempting a halting answer to your question.
I think I'm building off of this actually, and thank you again for the talk. I wanted to deliver on my promise to try to yank the rug out from you, but I was wondering if in thinking about well-being in schools, let's say, it seems as if the vision of the schools as an institution, either as means or ends or both, will sort of have some entailments, even if we're saying inclusion as preference aside, for how we go about orienting ourselves towards that inclusion. For example, if we're thinking about schools primarily as sort of like the locus of training for, to use the sort of the language that's often tossed around, career, college and career readiness, versus as a microcosm of society itself, and as sort of an end and a practice for a future inclusion. It seems like there are different entailments for how we think about inclusion, and also potentially different buffers against counter-arguments for exclusion. I'll leave it at that.
I wouldn't say, and probably you wouldn't either, that the two things you mentioned, those two different, let's say, goals, are mutually exclusive.
Yeah. Not necessarily. I was just wondering how, if you had a normative position on the institution of the school and its status as delivering means versus ends, and how you sort of coordinate those things.
Do I have a normative position? I gotta think on that one more. Because, ultimately you're asking me a question way beyond this talk, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. But it invites me to think at a very different sort of macro level about what I imagine the school's, let's say, primary task ought to be. Am I understanding your question?
Yeah, and I'm not even sure that it necessarily bears on inclusion, but I think there's a way of thinking about, even if our priority is for, our preference is for inclusion, and the sort of like substantiating, justification for this framework is inclusion. That orientation to the school as an institution will modify how we understand what that means.
Yeah. So that's a great question, and as I said, I'm going to have to reflect on this some more. I think whether we think, for example, about inclusion as a goal along the lines of we're a community here, and we all want to foster the conditions necessary to be members of a community, or whether inclusion is merely a necessary requirement, let's a necessary condition so that we can establish, let's say, safety, mutual regards, shared goals. But then what those goals are or should be is a separate discussion to be had. So is it a necessary condition? Is it a goal in itself? I don't take a normative position, certainly in this talk or in the chapter itself, on that particular question. What I do in other chapters in this longer manuscript is more critically examine or scrutinize what I think, normatively speaking, many of us imagine the school to be about or for. So, to take an example, many of us believe that the school is the place, par excellence, where we foster citizenship.
Right.
And that is a goal of the school. We need necessary conditions to do that, but that is a sort of an aim, and the school is instrumental in fostering that aim. And I take a very critical view of that normative claim. It's harder to do on this because I see inclusion around autism in cases of disability more generally as falling into the former category rather than the latter, namely as a necessary condition, where well-being is rather, let's say, the goal in mind, the more immediate goal in mind, and inclusion is something to get us there. That's how I'm thinking about it at the moment. Yeah.
So I would combine your combination to Eric and Krista, where you totally agree with this approach, which I found interesting, and the response about the Vienna School of Cultural Construction and Disability, to say, I can understand how, I'm going to take a stronger position than I likely actually hold. But, so in some ways, you are providing not formally utilitarian arguments that you're grounding it in, non-utilitarian theory, but basically utilitarian argument. If we care about kids' well-being, then we have to realize that, as you say, inclusion is not a proxy for justice, because sometimes inclusion can go badly wrong, and in fact, empirically, it often goes badly wrong, so we shouldn't be committed to it. If, however, one of the reasons that it goes badly wrong is, as Krista said, the invisibility, right? So we've constructed disability in a way that normalizes certain, neurotypical functionings that renders invisible certain neuroatypical functionings and leads us to actually condemn kids, punish them, bully them, whatever, if they have those, then we should not always pursue inclusion. But clearly the best state of affairs would be one in which schools are set up such that kids with all sorts of neurological ways of being in the world feel happy, cared for, are learning, are stimulated, feel heard and understood. And if enabling kids and parents to pull out of schools when it's not working for them maintains the invisibility and maintains the way of doing things that currently mainstream schools have, then we are never going to reach the ideal, right? Even close to the ideal. And so to some extent, we want to overcome the structural injustice that you mentioned that cuts against care and capability, et cetera. Then we have to push normal, schools to actually properly include kids. And the only way they can do that is in part by interacting with kids who are neurally atypical and learn how to do it better. And so to what extent is your argument one that is actually maintaining structural injustice in the long term for the sake of, as you claim, justice right now in the short term?
Whether my argument is sustaining structural injustice is it's an interesting way of framing it. I mean, whether individual parents, that's the way you were getting at it, I think.
Well, no,
Whether, for
I
example,
think your argument, right?
Yeah, you think the argument?
I think, as I say, I'm taking a stronger view here than I think I necessarily believe, but I'm saying that your argument that we should, that justice requires us to, the mitigation of harm and pragmatic alternatives, etc., as opposed to saying justice requires that we create schools that are appropriately inclusive, where including parents and autistic kids are going to have to be part of that creation.
Right.
That's what I'm saying is actually perpetuating structural
Yeah,
injustice.
well, we agree. But I'm not defending the structural injustice itself. I'm saying here's an ethically messy situation where the well-being of the child with autism is the paramount concern, so I'm kind of just really restricting the scope. How do you solve this in light of various structural injustices in the school? And you're saying unless we all stay in the system, right? Kind of a let's ban the opt-out option, right? Then it will never come about, right? I'm skeptical of that myself because I mean, let's imagine that there's no opt-out, right? Let's say that the parents deciding that the well-being of the child is being compromised, but rather than opting for a private school or a separate school or homeschooling, all three of which would be pragmatic alternatives in this particular, that they stay in the school and that they press, right? Now, that sounds great, right, in a philosophy seminar, except that what we know empirically is that most of these parents are so exhausted even getting the schools to even administer the care to their own child, and it's the most well-educated folks like us and the most articulate and demanding parents who are even able to do that. So I guess the way I do ethics in education, the way I talk about these things, is I very quickly move from here's what I think is a normative ideal to, okay, how well does this normative ideal actually match the reality on the ground? Doesn't mean that we go back to the previous slide, that we abandon the ideals, but that the ideals serve as a form of moral guidance. And they won't, even if we're pushing, I think only in the best case scenarios we're actually going to change the structural injustices in play. That's my own take. So I'm not a believer, if you take this particular case, in parents using their child as a sort of guinea pig to see, let's keep pushing, and meanwhile my child is suffering and being bullied and so on. So I think that's what makes this particularly difficult to sort out.
Yeah, so I think actually building on what you just said about how quickly you're moving from the ideal to the way it's playing out in practice helped me think about or articulate what I've been thinking about during this talk, which is that to me, especially in disability studies, the ideal of inclusion is a radical claim for justice that is like not just fairly demanding, but insanely demanding for what it requires schools to be like to actually be able to implement it. And there are fewer examples of schools that do it entirely successfully. So to me, like inclusion in regular educational settings is not being a proxy for justice, certainly in the practical sense, especially if we're thinking about scope and motivation on limited budgets. But in terms of the way in which and in many parts these are people theorists who are coming out of the social model of disability or the neutralist model on your account, who are arguing that if we actually start to understand disability as located not simply in people's bodies, but in between the body and institutional structures, we take account for worries about the invisibility of disability. And we are actually radically changing what educational settings even look like, so that we're not just sticking kids into typical classrooms. The very notion of what a typical classroom is changes. And so, like, to me, it seems again, I think I might be saying this too harshly, so it's an easy argument to knock down inclusion in practice versus inclusion in the ideal sense that I think those who are working around disability try to get at. And then as another empirical matter, there's a fair amount of empirical evidence that the segregated educational opportunities, especially within public education are equally as bad as the inclusive options. So when students are entering into separate classrooms, they're not seeing this opportunity as like, let's get them to some sort of academic standard. It's let's see if they can tie their shoes and not attack the child sitting next to them.
Totally agree. So this I just think that's great commentary. So I discuss a lot of these details in the chapter, which we're going to race through here. But if we were to go with both of your concerns here and actually insist and sort of keep pushing for schools to make good on these ideals and on these claims to care about justice in the caring environment, doing right by every child, I mean, the first thing you're going to hear from the teachers is, we didn't get the training.
Yeah.
Right? This is what we're hearing in the Netherlands, day in and day out. There is nowhere in our training that we are learning how to sort of deal with these challenges in the classroom. So, yeah, we practitioners, believe in these ideals, but then every day we're being confronted with more and more challenges. And as an ethicist, I'm trying to think about both these things at the same time. And what I notice among philosophers writing about educational justice is they often stay way up here, and they ignore a lot of this stuff down here. Or the empirical folks are doing this stuff way down here and documenting what's going on and paying little attention to how we might improve the situation. I'm trying to straddle both of these two phenomena at the same time.
And on that note,
Yeah.
because of after 1:30, I think we should say thank you, but you have a couple minutes to hang out. Is that right?
Yeah.